Hi, I'm Casey. This is I Don't Know What I'm Doing. Welcome back if you're new here. I really don't know what I'm doing, except that I'm going to talk about some books. Today I'm going to talk about the 10 best books I read in the year 2022. The order that we're going to do this in is 10 to 1. So the 10th best to the best of the best that I read this year. The 10th best book I read this year was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This book is about two women who are married, kind of coming back together after one of them has been on a deep sea exploration trip far longer than originally intended. And a lot of this is literary horror. It's very metaphorical. Everything that is happening could also be seen as a metaphor for suicidal ideation or through the change that inevitably happens with two people who are in a long-term relationship. My favorite part about this is just the way it is written and the way that Armfield uses metaphor and uses this beautiful prose to convey a lot of horror and a lot of everyday common horror that I think isn't always touched upon. A lot of horror tends to be bigger in scope, and while some of the things that happen at the end of this book you could also say were big in scope and possibly cosmic in nature, it's also isolated between these two people and what they're suffering and how they are trying to come back together after this lengthy time apart and the changes that they've both endured during that. And it was just absolutely beautiful. It made me fucking cry. It dealt with grief in a really intense and concise way, and I absolutely loved and appreciated that about this. The next book that is on this list is This Thing Between Us by Gus Marino. You're gonna see a theme here that this deals with grief, and as a person dealing with grief, you know, in my everyday life right now, this and Our Wives Under the Sea really hit home for me. They talked about the small minutiae and the ways that grief impacts you daily. This one in particular was so good about talking about grief when it's fresh, when it's still intense, and when it's not just intense for you, but it's intense for the other people who knew that person, and the ways that you try to come together but just sort of fail and struggle, and it still manages to be this intensely personal thing. Even though there are other people who know what you're going through, you can't know what each person is going through individually, and that disconnect that it leaves you with. It was really beautifully written. I think that this was really scary in places. I read this all entirely in one evening and I absolutely could not put it down. It was so gripping. I really felt for Thiago and what he was going through. I loved how open the ending was for this and how open everything that was happening was. It really left it up to you as a reader to decipher, was Thiago suffering some kind of mental break, or was this entity manipulating his life? I really love that. I love open endings. I love when an author will leave things mysterious and leave them open to interpretation. I think that makes everything 10 times scarier, and I love that about this. The next book on this list is Coyote Songs by Gabino Iglesias. This one was a complete and total surprise to me. I wouldn't have expected this one to have not necessarily appealed to me, but have such an impact on me and have such a hold on me. And I think about this book all the time. This book is about several people's stories intertwined into one big story, and I don't really know if I can give you much more of a synopsis than that. It's the way that people's stories are all similar but all distinct and their own, and the way they're interwoven throughout this narrative is just really, really intense and beautiful, and I loved it so much. I was reading this kind of on a whim, and I went into it sort of with this idea that not that I knew what it was, but that I was gonna just, you know, feel good about it, but not intense about it. And at the very end of the first chapter, I was like, oh shit, I'm here and I love this. And it was not afraid to go into these intense places, to these dark and gory and bloody places, but also these intense mental places. It was really beautifully done. I cannot recommend this one enough to anyone looking into this author for the first time. The next book on this list is To Be Devoured by Sarah Tantlinger. This one I picked up kind of on a whim. I was really interested in it but I saw that it was going out of print unless it was getting picked up by another publisher or a publisher in general. So I immediately grabbed it off of Amazon. This is a novella following Andy, a young woman. I say young woman, she's my age, in her early 30s. And she is kind of just struggling, not necessarily in her relationship or in her day-to-day life, but she is finding it hard to fit in her world and in the world that she lives in. And she begins to develop this obsession with these vultures that she sees near her property, and she begins to idolize them, and it kind of devolves from there. This was intense, it was bloody, it was weird, it was sexy in places, it's sapphic, and it was so strange. It was so strange. This is another one where I read in one sitting, and I was just so enthralled from moment one to moment done. It was it was intense, it was psychological, it was one of the few books that really gave me a physical reaction just based off of body horror and gore, and anytime I see little pigs and piglets, I kind of cringe because it reminds me of this. I absolutely loved it, and I loved how the author really played with, do you know if all this is actually happening? Is any of it happening? And I love the way it all resolved at the end. The next book I have on this list is Gory Details by Erika Engelhaupt. This is the only nonfiction I have on this list, and it was absolutely my favorite nonfiction I read this year. I absolutely adore this book. I have been recommending it to anyone who will listen to me. I and my husband, we bought it for everyone in his family for Christmas. I just thought this was so delightful. It is gory, like it says, but I really love the messaging of pushing yourself past your sort of, ick factor and your ick threshold, and really broadening your horizons to be more open to not only other cultures, but just the way that the world is kind of gross. It's, as people, we're just naturally gross. We have bodily functions, and they're nasty and they're icky, but it's just kind of how it works. And especially, after death, they're just biological functions that happen. And not only death, but just living in this world can be gross and opens you up to a whole host of possibilities and nasties that are just going to happen. And our existence produces gross things, and the existence of animals and all this kind of stuff. It was great. It's a short series of essays, primarily from her blog, I think, with the same name of Gory Details. And I loved it. I thought it was great. And again, it's another one that I just recommend to absolutely everyone. The next book I have on this list is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This is another one that I thought I was going to enjoy, but I was really shocked by how much I just devoured this, and I loved this. And I say devoured this, but I did take my time while reading it because it was very intense, and it did often, inspire me to put it down to sort of mull over what I had just read. And this is another one where I need to give you the fucking synopsis of, don't I? This is the story following Patrick Bateman, man in his, I think, early to mid-20s in the 1980s, involved in like Wall Street culture and stockbrokers and like the whole bro scene of everything, and his fascination with Donald Trump and women and himself and the perfect life. This is a satire on consumerism and capitalism and the hyper magnification of those two things, and also a satirical take on, toxic masculinity. It was intense, it was gory. There are also just pages and pages and pages of what people are wearing and what they're eating, and it was so funny at times and so intense. And I really absolutely adored this, and this is gonna be one of my all-time favorite books now. Okay, we have 4 books left, and the next one on the list is The Between by Tananarive Due. This is a novel following a man and his family, and he has a very strange relationship with death. He often feels like death is very close, and it has been following him since he was a young child. And this is him kind of coming, not necessarily into his own, but kind of coming to terms with death and with himself and his relationship to it. This is such a beautifully written novel, and this is one of my favorite novels I read this year that really does such a good job of playing with what's real, what's not. Is this actually happening? Is this in our character's head? And it's also just such a beautiful novel about family and about the struggle that this Black family is having in a world that is not built for them. And his wife is a judge, and she, you know, just due to the nature of being a Black woman with authority in the United States of America, she faces a lot of backlash and a lot of intimidation efforts. And it was so beautiful. I was listening to the audiobook of this, and I had it when my husband had a house full of people playing D&D, and they were upstairs having a good time laughing and giggling and doing silly things, and I'm downstairs listening to this audiobook, head in my hands, trying not to sob uncontrollably at the end of this. It was just so beautiful, and I cannot say enough just positive things about the author's writing and the way that she builds these characters that you love and you care about, and you want to see them happy, and you want to see the world just give them something. And I could go on and on and on about how much I loved this and how much it impacted me. But I'll stop there for now. The next book in the third slot in my top 10 books of 2022 is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I really thought this was going to be number 1 or number 2, but something snuck in at the end of the year, and we'll get there in a second, that just pushed it down. This is a story following Jade Daniels, a young Native American woman, as she is kind of struggling at the end of high school, trying to figure out if she's going to graduate or not, and her obsession with slasher movies. And she thinks a slasher is happening in her hometown, and we follow her as she begins to try to put the pieces together, but also while assigning everyone in town the roles of, you know, you're the final girl, you're this person, I'm the person no one listens to. It's so perfect. Everything about this is so perfect. It's so good. It's so good. This has one of my favorite, I don't know if it's necessarily a trope, but writing devices where you are so focused in on one character's point of view that you get nothing else. There's no, she is so intensely in her own head, and that is the perspective it is written from, that she does not consider anything else or anyone else. And I love that. I love that. I know some people really hate that in this book and they don't like Jade because of it, but I loved it. I thought it made her such an interesting character. Her life, just everything she's endured, just absolutely broke my heart, and just the way she was so intensely focused on trying to do everything she could to not only bring about this slasher cycle that she believes is happening in her town, but also while she's not willing to lose anyone and she's trying her best to do everything right. It's marvelous. It's marvelous. This is my favorite thing I've read from Stephen Graham Jones, and I haven't read a bad thing from him yet. It's just, it's so perfect. It was so good. I cried. I was listening to the audiobook. I was driving to pick my husband up because we had a vet appointment for one of our dogs, that one that's over there on the chair right now. And I just started sobbing in the car at the end because it was just so perfect. It was so perfect. It's so good. I love this. I love this so much. This is another book that's going to be one of my all-time favorites. And right now it's my all-time favorite, Stephen Graham Jones, and I cannot wait for the fucking sequel in a few weeks. I'm so excited. Hi, Next Day Casey here. I realized that in my basically hungry silly phase, I completely forgot to talk about a book yesterday. So my second favorite book of the year, one that I didn't initially anticipate making onto this list, is The Past is Red by Catherine M. Valente. This is a book following Tetley, a young woman who is living in a post-apocalyptic society on Earth, on Garbage. Is it Garbage Island? I think it's like Garbage Island or something like that, but there is this massive floating city of garbage in a world that has basically just been covered in water. and it is following her as she grows up and as she makes decisions that often have big impacts, not just on herself, but on others as well. This was one of the sweetest, saddest, most wholesome, most just heart-wrenching books I read the entire year, and it was one of the last, I think, 2 books I read in 2022. This completely swept me away. I listened to most of it in one evening, and I was just completely floored by how beautiful it was. One of my favorite things about this book, which is said, I found in a review on Goodreads, and I just completely echoed my own thoughts, was that Tetley is a character who is optimistic without being naive. And those 2 characteristics are almost always paired together. If someone's optimistic, they have to be naively optimistic. But Tetley's not. She's very well informed. She makes her decisions not out of a sense of naive hope, but just out of a beautiful understanding of her world and just wanting better for people. It is so sad, so sweet. I genuinely laughed out loud while listening to the audiobook for this more than once, and it was just absolutely wonderful. And this really was a contender for my favorite book this year, and I really had to give it long consideration before I decided where this went in the list. Done. I'm gonna go nurse that fucking headache. Okay, the last book we have on this list. The best book, my favorite book that I read in 2022. Kindred by Octavia A. Butler. I read this in February of last year, and it stuck with me the entire year, and it's going to stick with me the entire rest of my life. Not only is this beautifully and amazingly written, it has some of my favorite characters that I've ever read. It's Dana and Kevin. It's Kevin, right? Yeah, it's Kevin. Are so beautifully flawed, and their stories are intense. This has one of the best opening lines I have ever read in a book, with "I lost an arm on my last trip home." It brings you in immediately. I should give you a synopsis for this real fast. This is the story of Dana, a young Black woman, I believe in the early 1970s, and she finds herself time traveling back to the antebellum South, and she seems to be tied to this young man named Rufus, and this is their story of them finding their connection and finding out how this works, never a why, but how it works, and her being a modern Black woman in America, having to go back and see that all of the horrors that she knew happened, but having to experience them firsthand. This is a deep story of how chattel slavery breaks you as a person, and how racism is incipient and insidious and violent and psychological and physical, and just beautiful. This is another one where I don't think I cried at the ending of this, but it was really close to it. It is everything. It is incredible, and it is amazing, and it is the best book I read this year, and it is my favorite book I read this year. So that's it. That's my top 10 of 2022. I hope you had a good time watching this. If you did, do algorithm things if you want. If not, I don't really care, and I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm gonna go get a snack. Bye. The answer is no. He does not want me to move the pillows.